Now I'd like to introduce this morning's Regional Economic Update session. Each year at the Economic Summit, we release a comprehensive report on the state of the regional economy. This year's regional briefing book provides an overview of SCAG region, of the SCAG region's economy today, as well as an outlook for the counties. There is an assessment and discussion on incorporating equity in SCAG's long-term planning, as well as preliminary research into what drives good jobs in U.S. regions to help develop measures and strategies to promote good jobs in Southern California. SCAG has worked with a team of economists, and you'll find individual county outlooks in the appendix of the regional briefing book. And without further delay, please help me give a warm welcome to Gigi Moreno, SCAG's senior economist. Gigi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being with us here today. I'm Gigi Moreno. I'm SCAG's new senior economist in the Sustainability and Resilient Development Department. Last spring, I joined SCAG, and this is my first economic summit. And over the past 9 months that I've been at SCAG, I have worked on our inclusive economic recovery strategy, helped kick off the Connect SoCal 2024 plan, and have worked closely with our bench economists in preparation for this summit. I'm excited to be a part of SCAG, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to apply my research and experience to help make Southern California a better place to live and work for everyone. So in this segment of the summit, our Chief Economic Advisor, Wallace Walrod, will provide an overview of the SCAG region economy and will share his insights and outlook for the regional economy. He will also report economic highlights from the 6 individual counties that make up our region. In addition to being SCAG's Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Walrod is also the Chief Economic Advisor for the Orange County Business Council and the Draper Hero Institute. He is an expert in designing innovative program strategy and policy solutions for industry, government, and foundations. He has served as economic advisor to numerous private and public sector organizations, including Octane, Visionary Venture Fund, JP Morgan Chase, and Esri. He serves as an expert in residence at UC Irvine's Institute for Applied Innovation. I would like to thank Dr. Walrod for being an invaluable advisor and partner in this event. Please welcome Dr. Wallace Walrod.
Thank you so much, Gigi. That was a fantastic introduction. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure again this year to walk you through an economic update of the SCAG region and its 6 counties, with a forecast on what's to come and a focus on where economic growth and job creation will occur. Obviously, we're meeting again this year virtually at the end of another year of unprecedented change and uncertainty. We're addressing some of the greatest economic challenges, but I think what we want to focus on is not just the challenges today, but the opportunities that we see in the SCAG region. Next slide, please. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the work of SCAG's team of independent economists. The team brings together the talents of a diverse group of economists to report on what's going on throughout the region. So we have Mike Bracken from Imperial County, Shannon Sedgwick from LA County, myself from Orange County, John Husing from Riverside and San Bernardino, and finally, Matthew Feenup and Dan Hamilton from Ventura County. Next slide, please. Well, it seems so long ago now, but there is just a reminder, there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the economy in early 2020 before COVID hit. The SCAG region enjoyed near record low unemployment of 4.2%. But then COVID and some economists within the first month predicted that unemployment rates would exceed 30%. Thank goodness that never came to pass, but the SCAG region was hit hard. Employment fell by nearly 1.8 million jobs, or almost 20%, in just 2 or 3 short months, and regional unemployment shot up to 18%. Our unemployment rates in the region generally followed national trends, but as Clint said, the region saw more significant impacts stemming from COVID, and that's primarily due to the high proportion of entertainment and tourism related jobs that we have in the region. Well, since May of 2020, the region's unemployment rate has trended steadily downward, fortunately, falling to 6.9% in October 2021, which is the latest month that we have numbers for. Yes, the good news is how far we've come back already. It was 6.9%, as I said, at the end of October, but that was a big improvement from even September when it was 8.2%. And we were at about 10.4% at last year's summit. So we actually dropped 3.5% in the last 12 months since the last economic summit. That compares to a 2.9% drop in California's rate and a 2.3% drop in the US rate. So you can see that even though it hit us harder, we're coming back from that substantial reduction. That means almost 1.37 million jobs recovered so far since the low point of the COVID recession, which was May of 2020. Total current employment of about 8.6 million means that we still have about 450,000 jobs to recover, or about what the region gained in the last year. This means we can have somewhat confidence that by next year's economic summit, the region in all likelihood will have regained all jobs lost to COVID, barring anything unforeseen that is not built into our forecasts. Next slide, please. The SCAG region is, of course, the sum of its parts. While the economic and employment picture for each county has improved, the region's economy still remains, as I said, below pre-COVID highs. During the initial months, hardest hit industries were leisure and hospitality and other services. You might ask what other services is. Sort of a compendium of auto repair, machinery and equipment repair, personal care services such as barbershops and nail salons, dry cleaning, linen supply, and other similar businesses. You can imagine those kind of businesses were hit very hard. Then you may ask why information was hit so hard. Information includes the motion picture and television industry, interestingly enough. And so that's why the big fall in information in the region, because of how important it is, especially to LA County. In general, these industries have been the ones with the largest bounce backs to a degree. For example, tourism or leisure and hospitality saw the largest employment growth at 24%, followed by other services, transportation and warehousing, and information. Next slide, please. And as you can see, and Karthick will talk more about this, the majority of COVID-related job losses were in lower wage positions, which served to impact the region's at-risk communities. Lower income residents in communities were already dealing with significant challenges and hardships prior to the pandemic, but they felt not only the most employment losses, but furthermore, they have seen the slowest recovery and still continue to struggle, with total employment remaining almost 25% below pre-pandemic totals. By the way, one thing I wanted to say is that SCAG's regional data platform is it's a really interesting initiative. It's nearing completion and the launch is targeted for early 2022. The RDP, as we call it, will provide universal access to a growing collection of standardized data and web-based tools to assist with local planning, including planning for economic growth and recovery. Jurisdictions will be able to leverage authoritative data from SCAG and other sources to better understand challenges, identify patterns of inequity, and prioritize areas for policy intervention and infrastructure spending to accelerate that economic recovery. So we think it's a very important tool for the region going forward, and we're really pleased that it will be launching soon. Next slide, please. So what were the types of jobs that were lost? As I said a little bit, leisure and hospitality was one of the biggest, but you can see even sectors like government and others took quite a hit. One interesting thing, if you notice on this slide, so the ones in red on the right-hand side were the decreases. One industry, probably no secret to everybody, that's thrived in the last 18 months has been transportation, warehousing, and utilities, which gained a significant amount of jobs from February 2020 to the most recent data we have. And you can think of all those Amazon trucks and FedEx and UPS trucks that you see. Relatively, construction, education, and healthcare and professional and business services have also fared fairly well. Next slide, please. And where are our jobs being created? Now let's look at the region's recovery in just the last 12 months. So taking out that first 6 months when we saw job losses almost across the board. With the exception of mining and logging, which is a very small sector for the region, and financial services, which lost a de minimis amount of jobs, about 500 jobs, every SCAG industry has seen employment gains over the past year. Hospitality and tourism added by far the most jobs, 165,000, followed by professional and business services and education and health services. One key question is, where is employment growth in good paying jobs going to come from? I think it's so important for the region and its individual counties and cities. And how can we move forward by better supporting innovation, competitiveness, and next gen emerging clusters throughout the region? That's what our great panel a little bit later is going to talk about. So what should we focus on? Location quotients are a tool that we use to measure an industry's concentration in a particular area. Location quotient of 1 means it has a US average level of concentration. More than 1 is greater concentration in that industry. All of these that you see on the screen have significantly higher than 1 location quotients. And these reflect the key strengths in the SCAG region, such as Hollywood's entertainment industry. So now is the time to focus attention and investment in the most vibrant sectors that will fuel economic growth and recovery. And you can see how diverse the Southern California economy is, looking at the different counties with their unique strengths and opportunities. So for example, Imperial County with agriculture and livestock, LA County, obviously Hollywood, video, entertainment production, but also apparel and performing arts. In Orange County, we have a real focus on life science manufacturing, but also obviously with Disneyland and some of the other tourism assets, hospitality and tourism is a big deal here. Riverside has also some manufacturing, but also agriculture. And you see agriculture shows up in 3 of the 6 counties. For San Bernardino, in addition to manufacturing, it's all about distribution and e-commerce. And then Ventura County has quite a diverse set of industry clusters there. Next slide, please. Now onto a focus on our counties. So Imperial County is first up. We go in alphabetical order. And Imperial County, so can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, there we go. Has a great gross domestic product. Median household income hit a record high, as it did in most of the SCAG counties. The unemployment rate is currently at 17.7%. That means Imperial County is always a little bit more elevated than the rest of the region. That means there are about 13,300 unemployed people there. But as you can see, agricultural production, renewable energy are very important. Just as for some context, the 17.7 compares to 18.8% at last year's Economic Summit. And finally, as Mike Bracken, our economist from this Imperial County says, it has the most affordable housing price in Southern California, but I still think that's a record at $281,000. So you'll see quite a contrast with some of the other data from some of the other counties. Next slide, please. Okay, so for Los Angeles County, it has been lagging the region. LA County last year, though, was at, it's currently at 7.8%. So you can see it's a little bit elevated from the SCAG regional average of 6.9%. But it was at 12.1% last Economic Summit, and in fact has improved the most of any of the SCAG counties. But it still does lag that regional average. You can see it was at 18.8% in May of 2020. That was sort of the low point. And significant losses in hospitality, information, which, as I said, includes motion pictures and TV, and then retail trade. Now, LA County, LADC is, Shannon Sedgwick, our economist, works at LADC. And their forecast, unfortunately, is that payroll employment won't reach pre-pandemic levels until 2025, which is a little bit slower than most of the rest of the region. Those key sectors that are going to drive that growth are transportation and warehousing, and arts, entertainment, and recreation. And finally, there are some, and I refer you to their report in our regional briefing book. There are still some significant disparities, and I know Karthick is going to give us an in-depth review of that. So next slide, please. So in Orange County, we're down to 4.7% unemployment. We were at 7.5% last year. Leisure and hospitality has been we gained about 100,000 jobs in Orange County in the last year. About 56,000 of those were in leisure and hospitality. And we have so many job postings right now in the county, over 500,000 job postings in the past year with really good wages. Wages have posted some impressive gains. Wages went up 10.6% from 2019 to 2020. Or over $8,000 per job, and median household income is almost 100,000 in this year in 2021 dollars. Comparatively to Imperial County, our housing price is currently 1.12 million, the median housing price, and that low supply and persistent high demand, I think, is going to continue to keep prices probably high and rising, along with the low interest rates. Next slide, please. So in Riverside and San Bernardino, John Husing forecasts that in 2022, jobs will exceed where they were in 2019. So the recovery in the Inland Empire is going to be by 2022. And I should say Orange County, we're kind of on the same pathway. 2022, we will regain all the lost jobs. The 6.3% unemployment rate, it's interesting, both counties have the same unemployment rate. They were at 9 and 9.1 respectively last economic summit. Their big growth areas have been in logistics, healthcare, and construction. Retail sales taking a hit have initially was an issue for municipal budgets, but they have since rebounded quite strongly, 23% and 42% in the first and second quarter, 2021. Education is a key issue, and you can see some of John's work there in terms of the ethnic breakdown of the Inland Empire, and then some differential home ownership rates that I know Karthick is going to talk about regionally as well. Next slide, please. So on finally to Ventura County, it's interesting that prior to the pandemic, Ventura County was already experiencing a prolonged period of economic weakness. Some amazing numbers here from 2007 to 2018, GDP shrank by 15.4%. The labor force there has contracted every year from 2013 onward, and the population has declined every year from 2016 onward. As we'll look at a little bit later, the impacts in the previous slide that we had a few slides back, the impacts are not evenly distributed. Those in retail, leisure, and hospitality and personal services were hit very hard, but some sectors were pretty resilient: construction, manufacturing, and other kind of white-collar jobs, probably professional and business services. And Ventura predicts, so they're at 5% unemployment right now. They were at 7.1% last year, but our economists from Ventura County predict that they expect economic recovery to be slower than in neighboring counties. And I would say Ventura and LA County are probably on somewhat of a similar path. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are the county summaries. I do, the work that the economists have done that goes into the briefing book. I commend that to you to take a look at that, because there's some really great research in there. So the big topic on everybody's mind is, what about our ports? I kind of have, in short, have termed it strong demand meets big challenges. So the disruptions at the ports of LA and Long Beach have been caused by a combination of factors, really, and we really focus on three here. One is increased demand. COVID actually reversed a 60-year trend of increasing spending on services versus products. From the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2021, durable goods manufacturing spending increased by 23%, while non-durable goods increased by 8%. And also, consumer spending on products remains at elevated levels compared to before the pandemic. There's a high level of savings over the last 6 months or so that could continue to fuel spending on products. And also some GDP growth in the first couple of quarters could lead to increased consumer spending. The second are supply chain bottlenecks, and McKinsey has done some really good research on that. Per them, the supply of container ships has been falling, with overall capacity down by 11% from September 2020 to June 2021. Many shippers reduced their capacity in response to falling demand early in the pandemic, and the subsequent ramp up has clogged ports with new levels of congestion, and they are having difficulties adjusting to that congestion. In fact, the harbors ports of LA and Long Beach are processing 16% more containers than the 2018 record, but that's still not enough to break the backlog so far. And also, John Husing points out that Inland Empire industrial space vacancy is at 0.7, and they just can't accept many more containers in the warehouses. And finally, there's workforce issues. There's definitely a lack of trucking and railroad capacity brought on by labor shortages. Many older dock workers and truck drivers decided to retire during COVID. There are many job openings for drivers and longshoremen, but the pipeline for that industry is not sufficient to fill the gap rapidly enough. And then the limited workforce is hurting port capacities, lower ability to just move that cargo away. And these challenges have led to some early indications that GDP expansion has slowed in the third quarter. And then consumer confidence has also declined in most of the surveys. And one of the reasons stated is because of this logistics backlog. So McKinsey predicts an optimistic scenario that this situation will normalize after the first quarter of 2022. Their pessimistic is that it will linger on for a larger part of 2022. So stay tuned on that. And obviously SCAG's role with regional transportation plays a big part in that. Next slide, please. But help is on the way. There is no question these investments are needed in the infrastructure bill. And you can see the listing of the dollars that are coming to California. We know that investment is needed in the transportation network, but more broadly in things like broadband, water, EV charging stations, lots of things that need more investment. We have chronically underinvested in infrastructure in this country for decades. And so that will really help the SCAG region create jobs and economic growth, both in the short term, but also in the long term. It will, as you remember, when we do the economic analysis of the RTP SCS every 4 years, we look at both the job creation through the actual construction jobs that build these projects, but almost more importantly, the enhanced economic competitiveness that results from having a much more well-functioning infrastructure system. And last slide, please. So my conclusion is it's incredible how resilient the SCAG region, the Southern California region, has been. You can look at the unemployment rate that we've knocked down after initially being hit harder, knocked it down at a much faster rate than the state and nation in the last 12 months. We project at the regional SCAG level that recovery will occur by the next economic summit next year. And my fingers are crossed that next year's summit will be in person rather than virtual. But it has been an uneven recovery. Not only have lower income residents and communities been more impacted, but definitely, as you've seen, some counties and some sectors are lagging in terms of their recovery. Income and home prices are both rising. That's great news. But inflation has creeped up as an issue region-wide, well, statewide and nationally as well. So the way I say to encapsulate it is continuing recovery, but continuing challenges. So things that are out there that could be challenges are, as we've seen with Omicron, potential new COVID variants, trying to fix these supply chain disruptions, which I'm sure we'll make progress on in 2022. As I said, inflation is an issue, and then also labor shortages. There are a lot of job openings, and a lot of employers are seeing their not being able to staff back up to the level that they need to meet demand. So just a little bit more of an outlook. The economic benefits of this holiday season will depend a little bit on the resolution of supply chain disruptions. As I think Clint referred to, a lack of workforce housing could slow the region's recovery as well. But finally, I do want to say that I think that the SCAG region's strong fundamentals, and you've seen those industries that were hit hardest are bouncing back fastest. I believe that those strong fundamentals will help its continued recovery. And I think by the Economic Summit next year, we'll have a much brighter picture. This year is good. I think next year is going to be fantastic. So thank you so much for your attention. And now I will turn it back over to Gigi. Thank you so much. And please take a look at the briefing book, the presentation, and the individual county summaries. There's a lot of great work there. Thank you very much. Gigi?
Thank you, Wallace. So as Dr. Walrod explained, Southern California's economy is fundamentally strong and has a diverse and skilled labor force that makes our region resilient and prepares us to weather the challenges ahead. An important step in reinforcing a resilient economy is to build an inclusive and equitable economy. Next, we have Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan, who will share his insights on how SCAG can better incorporate equity indicators in our long-term planning. Dr. Ramakrishnan is a professor of public policy at UC Riverside and the executive director of the California 100 Initiative, a transformative statewide initiative focused on building an innovative, sustainable, and equitable vision and strategy for California's next century. Dr. Ramakrishnan applies his expertise in demographics, public opinion, civic engagement, and immigration policy to help strengthen the capacity of underserved communities. I would like to thank Dr. Ramakrishnan for his work in helping us prepare this summit and develop SCAG's inclusive economic recovery strategy. Please welcome Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan.
Thank you so much, Gigi, and thank you to everyone at SCAG, from leadership to members, for having this important conversation. We just heard a lot of important data points, including some of the latest data that Wallace presented. And an important part of understanding this recovery, if indeed we are building back better, building back differently, is to center inclusion and equity into the analysis, but also in terms of the action and steps that we take. Next slide, please. So in thinking about equity and why equity is important, of course, there are many normative or moral reasons we could bring to bear in terms of why it's important to make sure that when we're talking about recovery, when we're talking about future growth and prosperity, that everyone is lifted up. But it's not just a matter of morals. There's been plenty of research which indicates that inequity is not only socially harmful, but economically harmful as well. And this is research not only from Southern California or even the United States. This is research across countries by organizations like the International Monetary Fund, like OECD, as well as economists from throughout the world, which point to similar findings across contexts. And what they all find is that inequity, as it gets worse over time, is harmful for overall economic growth. And this is for a few reasons. One is the research tends to show that there are reductions in human capital investments. So for example, in terms of education, those who are at the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder tend to invest less in education when inequality increases. Similarly, you have research which shows reductions in physical capital accumulation. So for example, investments in housing, home ownership is one measure of physical capital accumulation. When you have growing inequity, you have fewer middle class and lower income residents able to accumulate assets. On top of that, when you have growing inequity, you have adverse health outcomes and the associated costs with those adverse health outcomes that harm long-term economic growth. And then finally, you also have growing economic and political instability and greater calls for protectionism. Certainly you've seen that in the United States, but again, these are patterns that are found across the world and including especially in advanced industrialized countries. Next slide, please. Now, coming to SCAG, this is work that SCAG has been doing for a while, especially with respect to its environmental justice work. But as you all probably know, in the past year, SCAG has taken some very important steps to make sure that equity, and especially racial equity, is more central to the work. And this is part of the Racial Equity Early Action Plan that was introduced earlier this year. And this is the working definition of racial equity that SCAG itself has. And I'll just read it here. As central to SCAG's work, racial equity describes the actions, policies, and practices that eliminate bias and barriers that have historically and systemically marginalized communities of color to ensure all people can be healthy, prosperous, and participate fully in civic life. I've just highlighted those words there so that equity is not just something that you put down on paper as aspirational goals, but that there are actions, policies, and practices that can be changed over time to make sure that we reach those goals. Next slide. Now, part of the work that we did that you'll see in the briefing book is to see what SCAG's existing products, especially Connect SoCal, how they fare in terms of data and indicators on equity. But before going into that, it's important to take one step back to talk about related concepts that some people may have questions about, how equity might relate to equality, for example, or how equity might relate to inclusion. These are related concepts, but they are distinct. So first, when we talk about equity, one important differentiator is with equality. Equality, the way most people conceive of it, is talking about equality of opportunities. And so that means that everyone has an equal chance at, say, applying for a certain program, winning a certain contract, that there's no bias in terms of people's chances of winning a contract, regardless of what region they come from, regardless of whatever socioeconomic barriers they might face, regardless of their racial background, ethnic background, gender, etc. The problem with that, of course, equality is something we all believe in. The problem with that is that if you have equal opportunities available to those who come from a very uneven playing field, you will perpetuate inequalities in those outcomes. So while equality in outcomes is something that we can all aspire to, equality of opportunities does not necessarily advance equality in outcomes. And in fact, what the evidence has shown is that when you have equality of opportunities that is built on a foundation that is fundamentally uneven, you will continue to perpetuate those inequalities without making any headway. So equity focuses more on the kind of corrective actions that you can take to create a more level playing field so that in the medium to long term, you can indeed move towards greater equality. Finally, inclusion is different from either equality or equity. What inclusion means in this context, when we talk about regional development, is the extent to which stakeholders are recognized, engaged, and granted influence. Now, what this means in practice is that when it comes to economic development, a lot of times who we think of as experts in economic development include researchers within academia or outside of academia. It includes businesses, including large businesses as well as small businesses. It includes employees in government agencies. But often we don't think of other community organizations as having expertise when it comes to economic development. So thinking about inclusion and trying to advance and innovate on inclusion means that we need to expand our view of who has expertise on economic development and what we could all gain in terms of improved actions, policies, and practices, right? I mean, this is right in SCAG's alley in terms of what they're thinking about in advancing equity, that you need to have inclusion in place in order to benefit from the lived experience, from the expertise that has been accumulated over decades and sometimes over generations to make for better decision making. So even though inclusion is not the same as equity, what the historical record has shown is that it's very difficult to achieve equity if you don't have inclusion. If you don't have the communities that stand to gain the most from those actions, if they're not part of the design of those solutions, chances are you're not going to get it right. It's going to be inefficient, ineffective, and probably cause a lot of frustration. Next slide. So that's kind of general background in terms of the kinds of concepts we're talking about in terms of building a more inclusive recovery and leading to more equitable outcomes, particularly when it comes to race and gender. Now, these are important in and of themselves, but especially coming out of the pandemic, we have seen why it's so important to pay attention to equity, especially as it involves race and also gender. So first, thinking about racial equity, what we've seen with the pandemic is some of those pre-existing conditions, if you will. If you look at individuals and households living in more crowded housing and precarious housing where they're couch surfing, for example, those are the conditions that made COVID more deadly, right? So for example, if someone got COVID, they could not isolate at home if they lived in crowded housing. And communities of color in Southern California and nationally were more likely to live in crowded housing. Black and brown workers were also more likely to be essential workers so that they could not take time off when they were infected or to be able to isolate themselves from other workers who were infected. We've also had longstanding pre-existing conditions, if you will, when it comes to food insecurity, where communities of color are more likely to be food insecure. And then finally, and unfortunately, what COVID also triggered was a wave of xenophobia that made communities of color and immigrant communities more likely to be targets of hate. And then long-standing patterns of excessive force involving Black populations in Southern California and elsewhere also increased the risk to communities of color. So these are all of the reasons why we need to especially pay attention to racial equity coming out of the pandemic. Next slide. What I presented earlier, we're talking about various community health impacts of the pandemic and the kind of racial disparities that we saw during the pandemic. But we've seen economic disparities as well. So if you look at the unemployment rate, and this is in the SCAG region, if you look at the unemployment rate among white non-Hispanic workers and everyone else, and comparing the COVID recession to the Great Recession, we've seen that unemployment among communities of color has been higher than among non-Hispanic whites. This was true during the Great Recession. It wasn't as true in the early onset of the COVID recession, but it is true today where you see higher unemployment among communities of color than among white non-Hispanics. Next slide. Now, if you look at it by gender, the animation didn't quite work, but if you look at it by gender here, what you see similarly that you have higher unemployment among men of color than among white men. This is true both during the Great Recession and during the COVID recession. When it comes to women, you saw an interesting reversal pattern in the early part of the pandemic, where white women had a higher unemployment rate than non-white women, but that has switched more recently, and it's more volatile. And it shows that COVID recession patterns when it comes to race and gender are different than before. Next slide. So what kind of steps can we take to improve racial equity as well as racial equity and gender equity? We have a framework at our Center for Social Innovation that we simply call DNA, data, narrative, and action. And what we say is that in order to find workable solutions, you need good data, and that's what makes whatever arguments we're making more credible. You need to have the data to make it credible. But you also need to have narrative to make it meaningful and memorable. We need to have those affected communities and their narratives to be uplifted in order for us to understand how it affects people on the ground, and really to also make many of these solutions more politically palatable. And then finally, it's not just about collecting the right data and the right kind of community narrative. We also need to pair it up with strategic action and make sure that the work is collective and strategic. Next slide. So in that vein, I'll make some data recommendations that you'll find in your briefing book. One is, it is important to disaggregate data by race and gender whenever possible. Now, sometimes you might not be able to find that kind of disaggregation within the data set. It is possible to overcome those data limitations through spatial disparity analysis. So to have disparity data in one layer and outcome data in another layer, and to do spatial joins or other methods to try to see what that disparity might look like, leveraging the fact that you have racial segregation by geography. You can also think about collecting supplementary data, including quantitative analysis as well as qualitative data, and including survey data as well as administrative data. Another recommendation we have is to, whenever possible, present county level data. You saw that in the presentation that Wallace had, but drilling down by racial and gender disparities to not only present data for the SCAG region, but whenever possible to present it county by county. And then finally, for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, to not only disaggregate by race, but also by ethnicity or detailed origin. There's tremendous variation across Asian populations, especially with respect to things like homeownership and socioeconomic status. And it is important to not only break it out by race, but also by ethnicity whenever possible. Next slide. Now, increasingly, when it comes to data, visualization is key. When you present racial disparity data with a table like this, a lot of people's eyes glaze over, they try to squint at numbers, and it's really hard to detect patterns. If you're trying to figure out, for example, if some counties have higher rates of racial disparity when it comes to home ownership than others. It is very difficult to do. It might be tempting to just say compare outcomes for whites as opposed to Black residents across counties, but that doesn't take into account the relative proportion of population within these counties. And it's just really difficult to visualize all of this data with one table. One recommendation we have is to use an index of disparity like the Hoover Index of Inequality. Next slide. And what we're able to do there is to summarize all of that data that was there in that prior table in terms of racial disparities in homeownership, you see on the left-hand side here. So with that Hoover Index, what we can tell is that homeownership, racial disparities in homeownership are highest in Orange County and lowest in Imperial County. So that we're able to summarize a lot of data points with a very simple index measure that is comparable not only in terms of outcomes. So for example, we can create, and in fact, in the briefing book, you'll see an index measure of poverty, which shows that poverty, racial disparities in poverty are actually even greater than racial disparities in home ownership. But you're also able to compare across categories. So what this graph shows you is that racial disparities in home ownership are much larger than gender disparities in home ownership. This is the kind of thing you can do by using an index measure where you're able to simplify, and this aids in decision-making. If you saw that table in the prior slide, it's very difficult to know, if racial disparities are worse than gender disparities, for example, and which county might need the most attention when it comes to racial disparities in homeownership. Next slide. I'm running out of time here. So finally, just quickly, I'll say with the two last slides, it's not just about data. We also need to focus on narrative as well as action. We need to make sure that our narratives are more accurate, that they're updated with the newest economic and demographic realities, so the images and mental models we have in our heads are not outdated. We also need to make sure that our narratives are more inclusive. Whose stories are being elevated, whose stories are invisible. And then finally, we can also try to be more aspirational in our narratives. You might have heard of this term, an asset-based narrative as opposed to a deficit-based narrative. When you have deficit-based narratives about communities, about regions, it is really difficult to encourage more investment. People do not invest in problems, they invest in solutions. So more aspirational narratives showing who is part of the solution and why it's important to invest in them can be more fruitful in terms of inspiring action. And that's the final thing. It's the A in DNA. We need to have intentional, strategic, and enduring action. And specifically when it comes to economic development, equitable action when it comes to education and workforce training, equitable access to healthy communities, and equitable access to lending and entrepreneurship support. Final slide, next slide, please. Part of what we do at CSI, and if you go to our website, you can go to socialinnovation.ucr.edu/frameworks, is to come up with frameworks that catalyze action. And with the American Rescue Plan and the latest infrastructure dollars, we have built a framework in partnership with community over the last couple of years. And this framework is what we call Ready to Rise. There's so much of a focus on readiness, including shovel readiness, which of course is important. But if all we do is focus on shovel readiness and not pay attention to resilience, to inclusion, to sustainability, to equity, we are really not building back better. What we're doing is business as usual. If we want to build back better, we argue, we need to focus on these other concepts. And what we do with our frameworks is to provide solutions. So we have concrete indicators connected to each of these concepts. We've put it in practice with a particular study of the Salton Sea region, which includes parts of Eastern Riverside County and Imperial County. And we are continuing this work and iterating it. I encourage you to check it out. And please feel free to email me if you have any thoughts or suggestions on ways that we can improve these indicators.
Thank you, Karthick. You can read more about the state of the regional economy, our county economies, and Dr. Ramakrishnan's equity recommendations in this year's regional briefing book. The regional briefing book is available at scag.ca.gov/economic summit. And it includes data and graphs that you all love. So go check it out. Thank you.